okay. That's Russell Wilson. Did you expect anything different? Does it surprise anybody?
I'm glad you're doing this podcast because I always thought, I don't know if it's quite worthy of a 30 for 30, but it's worthy of mini-series or segment. There's a lot to it.
99.9 The Fan's Joe Giglio and Joe Ovius set the record straight in Never Failed, the Russell Wilson Story podcast.
Brought to you by Copiers Plus. If you don't know how much printing expenses are costing your business, you're probably spending too much. Gain clarity with a free assessment from Copiers Plus. Book yours today at copiers-plus.com.
One of the most important parts about Russell Wilson's exit from NC State is also one of the most obvious, and it's really the one that's often overlooked. Tom O'Brien wasn't the coach when Russell Wilson committed to NC State in 2006. Chuck Amato was. And Amato had in his own background at NC State where he was a wrestler and he played football. Add to that, during his long tenure at Florida State as an assistant to Bobby Bowden, Amato had seen firsthand two sports stars like Charlie Ward and Deion Sanders. So Amato knew the balancing act could work and at the highest level. Now compare that to O'Brien's background at Navy, Virginia, and Boston College. Hardly anyone at that time would confuse any of those schools for baseball schools. In O'Brien's background, a player picked a sport and stuck with it. That was part of the commitment. That was part of being with the team, is that you spent your time with the team. O'Brien and Wilson would disagree about Wilson's involvement in baseball pretty much from the start of their relationship. But when Wilson was being recruited out of the collegiate school in Richmond, his agreement was with Amato, his staff, and longtime NC State baseball coach Elliott Avent. Now, how Wilson ended up at NC State, well, I'll let Avent tell the story from the baseball side, and Amato's offensive coordinator, Mark Trestman, will fill in the blanks on the football side. If you're not familiar with Elliott Avent, he grew up an NC State fan in farm country outside of Rocky Mount. He went to NC State in 1974, right after they had won the national title in basketball, and returned to Raleigh as this lower-level assistant officially in 1987. It was for the baseball team, but unofficially he was basically a gopher for Jim Valvano, who then was, of course, the basketball coach, but also the athletic director. For Elliott, this couldn't have been a better experience because any other coach might take the fan label as an insult. But for Avent, truly, he is the biggest NC State fan I know. Since he was hired by NC State in 1997 to be the head coach, he has made it part of his job to be friendly with the other coaches. I mean, he goes to more football practices than anyone not in a uniform, and has for the past 25 years. Avent had actually coached Andrew Brackman, who was a baseball star at NC State and also played basketball. And so it was not unusual for him to try to find players that would not only help his team, but the others at NC State. When he went to this recruiting showcase tournament in Salem, Virginia, he didn't know who Russell Wilson was. After a few innings, though, and a tip from a friendly fan, he thought he had found something special for NC State baseball and potentially even football.
I'm at the Commonwealth Games in Virginia, and that's where they take the best. It's like the state games of North Carolina. They take the best players in the state of Virginia, and they bring them all to a certain site. This year, I think it was Salem, Virginia. And you watch game after game on the game. And this field, first of all, it wasn't a perfectly manicured field to start with, okay? And then you take the number of games that's being played back to back to back. This field wasn't ideal for defense. And I'm watching this game, and I'm watching this shortstop and second baseman. There was a second baseman beside him.
Okay.
He's talented as well.
Okay.
And so I usually sit when I go to games.
But you didn't go there thinking, I'm going to go see Russell Wilson.
Oh, no.
You went there because it's a showcase of the state of Virginia.
Absolutely.
And you're like, hey, there might be some players out there.
Oh, you go everywhere every year. And you got names that you're going to look for.
Sure.
But Russell wasn't one of the names that I had.
Right.
So I see this shortstop. And like I said, the field wasn't great. He was getting bad hop after bad hop after bad hop. He never missed a ball.
Mm-hmm.
It's like incredible instincts, incredible hand-eye coordination. I'm going, holy cow. Then you saw the arm, you saw the athleticism, you saw the body, and you're going, this guy's interesting. You know what I'm saying? But so John Mirabelli, who when I first came to NC State, Ray Tanner hired me. John Mirabelli was the pitching coach. John Mirabelli kind of taught me how to scout. And he always said, Elliot, never sit like where everybody else sits. All the college coaches sit together. All the scouts sit together. Right. Go sit by yourself.
Right.
Watch the game and listen to what the fans say. Sometimes fans just like to talk, and you'll get different tidbits you're not going to get from somebody else. And so I've always done that. And I want to find out more about this kid. So I just figured I'd kind of talk to myself. And I just said to somebody, wow, that shortstop, well, he's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget this I grew up on a farm. So wearing the bib overalls, the overalls that I grew up everybody wearing. And he said, boy, if you think he's a good baseball player, you ought to see him throw a football. I said, really? He's a good football player? He said, good. He said, are you kidding me? He is not only the best quarterback in this state, he may be the best quarterback this state's ever had. So I just kind of started talking to the guy. I said, wait a minute, how about so-and-so? How about so-and-so? I knew a few names that had come out of the Tidewater area, and he said, better than all those guys. I said, okay. So I walked away, and I called Chuck. I just walked away and called Chuck. I said, Chuck, Russell Wilson. He said, I'll get back to you. And Chuck called me back a little bit later, and he says, my guy says he's a little bit undersized, a little bit too short for quarterback. I said, okay. I said, but I'll call you when I get back. I'll come by and talk. He said, but, get a film on him, get something on him, And so I talked to Russell afterwards, and we didn't have the kind of money to get Russell Wilson to come out of state to NC State on baseball. But he wanted to play both anyway. He's a football player, and he knew he was a football player. One thing about Russell Wilson, he believes in himself and everything he does. I tell our players all the time, if you don't believe in yourself, how do you expect somebody else to believe in you? And Russell was going to play both, so it didn't matter if I offered him not in just baseball, but I wanted him. But I went back home, and Mark Trestman at the time, he and I had developed a great friendship. He was the offensive coordinator, and he and I would probably go have coffee at least once every 2 weeks, maybe once a week. We just go sit by ourselves and have coffee and talk about everything. And so I went and had coffee with Mark, and I said, hey, I ran across this guy, and he's undersized in the state of Virginia. And he said the same thing, get me the film. So somehow they got the film got to Mark and Chuck. And I remember Mark, next time I saw him, whether he called me or whether we had coffee, he said, Elliot, that guy can play. He's a big-time quarterback. He said he could throw on the run so accurate. So I think him and Chuck talked, and I think they got Russell to a camp, football camp.
Right.
And I think the rest is history. They saw him at camp, and they offered him. I don't think they offered him that day, but I think they offered him not long after he went to the camp, and I think and Russell committed to us. But it was always to play baseball. He was adamant. And Chuck and I talked, and Russell and I talked, and his dad was a part of that. He was adamant it's going to be both ways. I'm going to play football in the fall, and I'm going to play baseball in the spring. That was Russell's deal because he loved both sports.
So just to make sure I didn't miss anything with Elliot, I had asked him, you were in concert with Chuck when it came to how Russell will be able to split his time between both baseball and football.
Yeah, absolutely. Because first of all, Chuck had to be in concert with that because that's what Russell said. That was Russell's thing. I'm going to play both. And it wasn't like, yeah, I know you're going to play both. But he said, I'm going to play baseball in the spring and I'm going to play football in the fall. And Russell was so dedicated and committed. Is the one word I can say about Russell is just, you can say discipline, you can say all these things, but he's committed to what he's doing. So when he played football in the fall, I never saw Russell. He didn't come over on off days and hit in the cages. He'd come over and see the guys once in a while because he knew his value as a part of the team was being around. So he understood that part of it. But and when he was playing baseball, he didn't go throw footballs either. He would show up to lifting because he understood his value as a to be around the other guys as a leader of that team, especially in the quarterback position. So he knew his value. So he'd go to early morning lifts to be around. But when it was baseball season, he wanted to play baseball. When it was football season, he wanted to play football. He wanted to be self-dedicated and self-devoted to that sport. And Chuck was committed to that because, Chuck had been at Florida State. He had some high-profile guys, Deion Sanders, Charlie Ward. There's a couple guys that come to mind. And Chuck was a big-time wrestler out of high school. You know what I'm saying? A big-time wrestler. Yeah. So Chuck understood dual sports back in the day when dual sports existed. He understood that probably more than most.
How quickly did it take you to figure out that Tom O'Brien did not have the same thought process on Russell playing two sports as maybe Chuck did?
Probably the day that I went over to talk to Coach O'Brien in his office.
So Chuck gets fired after the 2006 season,
right?
Which would have been Russell's senior year of high school football. Spring of 2007 now, Russell is going to come to NC State.
Right.
Did you have conversations with Tom? What was your first conversation with Tom about Russell?
When Chuck got let go, his recruitment process in most people's eyes, that starts over again. Duke was trying to get.
Right.
I think Russell might have gone to a camp at Duke. Like the week he went to NC State's camp, I think he made the tour.
Yeah.
I think he went to Carolinas. I think he went to Duke's and Wakes. So he made the swing through Tobacco Road, and everybody wanted him. Carolina wanted him, and whatever worked out there. But when Chuck was gone, I think Duke tried to get back in there. And so Russell went back through the process with Tom O'Brien to make sure the commitment was still there that he was going to play both. So there wasn't a lure for Duke. If Russell wanted to say, hey, listen, coach I committed to is gone, he could have got out of the letter of intent. He could have gone to Duke. So my thing is I had conversations with Russell about this to keep him in the fold at NC State. And Coach O'Brien and Russell and Russell's dad, they had conversations. And the thing was he was still going to play both. And I think football coaches sometimes think you're going to play both. That's fine. You can play baseball when we're not doing anything with football, including spring football and all the other things that it entails, which doesn't leave much time for baseball. So that's where the confusion was. Yes, I think Coach O'Brien said he could play both, but in Coach O'Brien's mind, it was like when nothing else is going. So my thing, I went to talk to Coach O'Brien after that first year didn't go very well. So I went to talk to him. And when I got back, Coach Hart said, how'd that go? And I said, not very well. And Coach O'Brien did all the talking. You know what I'm saying? I basically sat down in his office, and he let me know basically how things were going to go. And I promptly left because I figured, and Coach Hart, I remember he said, and you didn't argue with him? I said, I don't think arguing was going to win that thing today, and I don't think arguing was in the best interest of Russell because I don't think that would go well for Russell. So we're just going to have to bite the bullet this year and try to get ready for next year.
One thing that has always interested me about Russell Wilson, the baseball player, was what position was he going to be if he had just stuck with baseball? Last question I had for Elliot Avent about the recruitment of Russell Wilson was, why do you think he was so overlooked in this process?
What I believe is the reason he got overlooked in football, in my opinion, is one, everybody recruits to certain areas, certain hotbeds. You know what I'm saying? If you take the state of Georgia, it might be the entire state. You know what I'm saying? But if there's certain hotbeds in certain states. In Virginia, I think at that time, it was the Tidewater area. It was Virginia Beach, the Tidewater. That's where the players were coming from. And Russell was at a private school in Richmond, and I think he just got overlooked. And then you put the fact that he's not 6 feet, which sometimes we put a benchmark that somebody has to, like in baseball, you have to throw a certain velocity or I'm not going to look at you. Football, maybe for quarterbacks, you have to be a certain measurement or we're not going to look at you. And I think coupled with the fact that the hotbed was Virginia Beach, not Richmond, then you add to it that he was in a private school, playing in a private league. And his height, I just think he got simply overlooked. I think it was just, you'd have to go back to the football people that do this for a living, but I just think he simply got overlooked.
I think time has been kind to former NC State head football coach Chuck Amato. I credit a lot of the current NC State football culture to his arrival back when he was hired in December of 1999. Because for a while there, Joe, it was oversimplified. Chuck Amato had Phillip Rivers, and then he didn't have Phillip Rivers, and that was a wrap for him. But it goes a little deeper than that.
Sure, you have to think of it this way, Joe. NC State's been playing football in some form since 1892. In 2002, with Chuck Amato as the coach, that's the only time they've ever won more than 10 games in a season. It's the only time they've won double-digit games in a season. So he has to get some credit for the success that he had. Of course, all of that success came with Phillip Rivers, a player he didn't recruit. So whatever the opposite of NC State stuff is, NC State coaches have this way of giving their successor a gift. In Mike O'Kane's case, it was Phillip Rivers. Joe Pate had recruited Phillip Rivers. And in Chuck's case, at the end of his tenure, he had found Russell Wilson. And the shame there is all this time Chuck had spent trying to find the next Phillip Rivers, Jay Davis and Marcus Stone and anyone else. And he finally did find that next NFL quarterback, but he never had the chance to coach him.
Adam Gold and I have spent a lot of time talking to Chuck Amato over the years, whether he was the coach at NC State or when he left NC State. We talk about the NC State-North Carolina rivalry. But one of the more interesting conversations we had with him was when Russell Wilson was starting to become a thing in the NFL.
When we recruited him, I made the statement that he was a 5 foot 10 and a half, 5 foot 11 inch Charlie Ward with a stronger arm and probably even better location. I can remember like it was yesterday that we had a football camp, and we had just finished the morning session, and I had to run somewhere. I had an appointment with somebody, and I ran out to go take a shower, and all of a sudden I get a phone call, and Coach Nettie said, "Coach, you got to get out here." I said, "Why?" He says, "You got to get out here and see this quarterback." And he said, "He just got here." I said, "Well, who is he?" And he said who he was. I said, "Well, how come I haven't seen one tape?" He said, "Well, no, we haven't had a tape." And he brought a tape with him. "Well, come on out here." So I ended up missing the appointment I had, which was the best thing I did. So I went out there, and before I said, "Well, how big is he?" He says, "Don't worry about how big he is." So no, and he wanted to play baseball, and that was the big thing, and we were going to let him do both, and could not offer him any scholarship at that point because, the NCAA rule said you can't do that in a camp, even though a lot of people do it. But I said, we're going to abide by the rules and we'll do it properly. I said, "Hey, give me one more year. If I don't do it, I'll walk away from my school. But I know what the problem is, and we're going to get this kid and it doesn't solve the problem, And but he was really, really good in high school. And all you can go by is what you see. And I wasn't concerned about his height. Well, he's not tall. He can't see over people. He can't this. Quarterbacks throw through windows anyway. Not many of them throw over top of people, Offensive linemen are tall. Defensive linemen are tall. When they put their hands up, they're taller. And I don't care how tall you are, that includes film.
Just to give you an idea of how small the coaching world is, Mike Archer became Tom O'Brien's defensive coordinator. Archer had previously worked with O'Brien at Virginia. Well, Archer had also worked with Mark Trestman at the University of Miami before Trestman had started his NFL coaching career. Listen to the story that Archer tells about Trestman, his friend, and Wilson, the obscure recruit.
When we looked at the recruiting class, I remember his name. I knew he was from Richmond, the collegiate school. I do remember all that. And I kind of looked at his height, and I said, he might be a little bit too small. And I had never seen him play, didn't know him from Adam. And come to find out, the guy that had recruited him originally, who found him, was Steve Dunlap, who was the defensive coordinator, who was a very close friend of mine. Coached at West Virginia for years when I was with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Steve was a good friend of mine, still is, and he's the one that found him in Richmond. And then Mark Trestman, who I worked with at Miami, and I worked with in the CFL, and I worked with in Tampa last year, and we are very close friends, was actually the one that I believe recruited him and made the decision to take him. And Mark and I have talked about this since Russell has gone on to stardom, and Mark just thought the kid had so much ability, and he had so many innate qualities of leadership, and Mark is big into leadership as a quarterback guru, and the way he conducted himself, but the ability to extend plays. Now, I've never seen this kid, Joe. I have no idea.
Did you have a conversation with Mark before the season that started?
No, not until he got on campus.
Okay.
When I first got here, I went to watch the Super Bowl that night at Mark's house with his family. I watched the first half, and then I went over with some of our coaches because we were living in a hotel, and it never came up. It never really came up until after I was done here at NC State. We had coffee up here in the North Hills.
Yeah.
But by that time, I had talked to Russell.
Sure.
Numerous times. And he asked me, did you know Coach Trestman? I said, yeah. I got him started in coaching at Miami many years ago. So, that kind of started the relationship and my love for baseball, which, I've always followed baseball. I played baseball. Actually went to Miami to do both.
Is that right?
Yeah. And so – when Russell got here, we just naturally hit it off because of football, baseball, and I didn't know that he was that good a baseball player when he first got here. Had no idea.
One of the smartest things Chuck Amato ever did as NC State's head coach was hire Norm Chow. Chow made his bones at BYU forever, working with Jim McMahon and Steve Young and Robbie Bosco. And Amato had hired Chow to be his first offensive coordinator, his first quarterbacks coach. But Chow left after 1 year with Phillip Rivers. He worked with Rivers for 1 year and then went to USC, where he helped USC win a bunch of national titles. This was a pattern for Amato. He could find good assistants, but he couldn't hold on to them. Mark Trestman had spent most of his coaching career in the NFL up to this point. He notably had been the offensive coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers for 2 years in the 90s, and then he was with the Raiders at the start of the 2000s and when they made the Super Bowl. Trestman had joined Amato's staff in 2005. That was the year NC State had that really good defense. Mario Williams, Manny Lawson, really top-ranked in the country. That team went 7-5, went to the old Meineke Car Care Bowl, which is now the Duke's Mayo Bowl. And I knew Trestman was one of the first people in football to really believe in Russell Wilson's potential. That much I knew. What I didn't know was how he had graded Wilson after he had put him through a workout in Raleigh in 2006 when Wilson was still in high school. Trestman would go on to have success in the CFL after he left NC State, and he actually became a head coach in the NFL in 2013 with the Chicago Bears. So he has seen and he has worked with a lot of quarterbacks in his career. I find his insight about Wilson to be fascinating, especially after really just one workout and getting to know him during the recruiting process.
First of all, I would say that, anytime you recruit a young man, it's a group effort. There's a lot of people involved in the process, and certainly it started with Steve and his recommendation to Chuck Amato, the head coach, that, we take a look at Russell. So I think, Elliott Avent was, very much a part of that as well, since he was over at the baseball field and called and see if we'd be interested in recruiting and talking to Russell. And we did. And then we proceeded to go work him out. I had looked at his tape and was very impressed with his tape. Not taking into consideration the quality of the league he was in, because he was not in a upper echelon league in Virginia. He played at a small, very good private school. But Elliott called me and said, that Russell, was there. He was recruiting him for baseball, but he also wanted to play football as well. So, there's a lot of space here between events, but it led to me taking him out on the field and working him out and watching him, move and throw and and do the things that you do when you work out a quarterback, and spent time talking to him as well during the however many hours we spent together.
Mm-hmm.
And after I spent time with him, just talking with him and working him out, I went into Chuck and I said, I just worked out Russell, and if I was in the NFL where I spent most of my coaching career, I would have given him a 3rd-round grade physically and a 1st-round grade charismatically, so to speak, that he had, high-end elite leadership skills and ability to communicate and football intelligence. And as I said, I gave him a 3rd-round grade, and I said, Chuck, the only reason I gave him a 3rd-round grade is because he's 5'10".
Right.
And there haven't been many that have transitioned to the NFL at that height, but the issue was, if we want to recruit him, we got to let him play both baseball and football. And I asked Chuck what he thought, and he said, why shouldn't he? And, I grew up on the Socratic method. I knew the answers to the test before I asked the question. And I felt the same way, that this is the time of his life. College is the time of your life. And if you want the opportunity to play both football and baseball, our job as coaches allows you to self-actualize, not just in the classroom, but on the field. And if that means playing both sports, we can make it work. And to give him the opportunity to do both. And, when we talk about who is responsible, it started with Steve, but it certainly, went through Elliot and certainly Chuck understanding what's really important.
Sure.
That somebody comes to college and we want to maximize his fullest potential, on the field. And if that means on 2 fields, he should have the opportunity to do that. So it was a non-issue of him playing both baseball and football. And then, once I got the go-ahead from Chuck, we immediately did everything we could to try to sign him.
You mentioned his leadership skills. How do leadership skills stand out in a workout like that in such a controlled environment?
Well,
obviously,
like I said,
you got to be special, right?
We spent time, making all the throws, but we also spent time just sitting around and talking.
Mm-hmm.
And it was easy to see that this was a very charismatic young man, probably, a lot more aware for his age than most. Very, like I said, confident in himself, humble, vulnerable in a sense that he was open to strengths and weaknesses, and just a level of maturity that, being around young people in this business, you knew that he was special.
You don't strike me as somebody, as an evaluator, who cares much about stars or recruiting rankings.
No, I never have. I think that I never did. I have to allow my eyes to be on the player and my ears to be on the player, and to make that determination. The difficult part is always transitioning, the competition that they play against.
Sure.
But when you work a quarterback out and you see him move and you see him throw and you see arm talent, you see, ability to make all the throws and the footwork and the quickness in his lower body to be able to move around and make things happen and the awkward throws. And to evaluate a quarterback, you really have to see him in person. That's why, coaches go out all over the country to see these workouts, because you don't really have a feel for a quarterback, in terms of his arm talent, unless you are able to see him in person. Some of the other things you can see on tape, but you really need to look at him up close. And you certainly have to spend time talking to him, because, the most important room in all of football is the quarterback's room. And that's where everything starts in football. It starts from inside out. It starts in that room, and you have to have somebody that you can relate to, somebody that is willing to spend the time and put in the work. And it was very evident that Russell was going to be that guy.
You mentioned his height. Did you have to sell Chuck on his height, or did Chuck just kind of explicitly trust you when it comes to quarterback?
Yeah, he really just trusted me, and his height was not an issue with me. I grew up watching Fran Tarkenton, and he was barely 6 feet tall. So, and there's other quarterbacks who played the game that probably were a little less than 6 foot, and but his athleticism, his foot quickness, his arm talent, his football intelligence, his charisma, kind of overrid his height.
On your way out from NC State, did you leave a scouting report or leave a file for Tom O'Brien and his staff or Dana Bible? Did you ever have a conversation with Dana about Russell?
No, nobody ever asked me about anything, and certainly, I would have loved, if, and I always felt this way, if Chuck could have had, and this is no disrespect to Tom and his staff, but if Chuck could have had one more year and had the opportunity to coach Russell Wilson, who knows, where things would have gone. But, the recruiting of Russell, just to summarize, wasn't me. It was a lot of people working in the same direction. And, and Elliott had a lot to do with that by going out of his way and trying to do what's best for the kid and not just what's best for his program. And that's, you learn a lot of different things from people along the way. And, Chuck and Elliott were very unselfish. They didn't act in the interest of their program. They acted in the best interest of Russell. And, I got a lot of respect for them for that.
One of my favorite things in sports is when somebody becomes a superstar and then you get the retroactive stories. In the case of Russell Wilson, he goes in the third round to the Seattle Seahawks. They end up hitting big with Russell Wilson. But then in the story of Russell Wilson, you'll hear former general managers talk about, in that draft, we had him high on our board. Had he been there when it was our turn to select, we would have taken Russell Wilson. But it goes beyond just the draft. It goes to recruiting as well, which is funny because what was Russell Wilson's recruiting rank?
1,102.
That's amazing still. That number still gets me to laugh every time. So that context is really important. It helps us understand how Elliott Avent and Chuck Amato and the deal about scholarships helped Russell Wilson get to NC State. But they weren't the only triangle school that was interested in Russell Wilson.
No, this is one of my favorite parts of this story, Joe. And that is Russ had wanted to play somewhere close to Richmond, but the state of Virginia, those two ACC schools, they had already had their quarterbacks all lined up and set. So Russ made a plan to come visit North Carolina, NC State, Duke, and Wake Forest. And when he went to North Carolina, the quarterbacks coach at the time was Frank Cignetti. And Frank Cignetti thought, wow, this Russell Wilson kid, he's really good. So he goes to John Bunting and says, we should at least offer this kid because I think he's a special talent. And Bunting says, no, I gave my word to Mike Paulus that I wasn't going to recruit another quarterback in this class. Mike Paulus, you may not remember, was the 82nd ranked player in that class.
Gold and I actually talked to Bunting back in 2014 as Russell Wilson was establishing himself as this NFL superstar. And to hear I wouldn't call it regret, but the understanding of, look, man, recruiting was recruiting, and we gave guys these words, and we had to stick to our words, and there were other factors in play, but you can hear the pangs of regret of what could have been at North Carolina. Could Russell Wilson have been a Tar Heel?
I really do believe that he would have been a Tar Heel if we had not already made a commitment, and a commitment made back to us by a guy that had a little bit more star power at that time, a guy by the name of Mike Paulus. I got a call when I was doing a Rams Club meeting in Fayetteville, and when I released that information that Mike Paulus had turned down Southern Cal and Pete Carroll at the 50-yard line and was committing to North Carolina, we jumped for joy. And you know how many players he brought in with him? A bunch of other guys jumped on our bandwagon. And if you remember that class, of course, I never coached, but of that class in our redshirting class in 06, 9 guys drafted in the NFL. So it was a pretty good class, and Mike Paulus helped us bring that class in. But I will never forget, here's the story, guys. We knew that Russell Wilson was a good quarterback. We watched his tape. He had all the great mechanics that great quarterbacks have. And we brought him to our camp. His high school coach had told me when he was in 10th grade that we'd want to have this guy. And we brought him into our camp, and Frank Signetti, who is now the quarterback's coach for the St. Louis Rams, worked him out and said, that is the best workout I've ever seen. He wants to come here. We got to get him. I said, what do I do about Paulus, guys? We had a little staff meeting. So I take Russell Wilson and throw Michael Paulus under the bus, the 6'3", 6'4" star power guy, and bring in this 2-star guy that's 5'11", 200 pounds? What are the big boosters going to say? Well, of course, Russell never made it to us, made it over to State, and the rest is history. It's one of those deals. It's one of those recruiting analysis that you've got to make sure you are doing the right thing for your program. Russell, 2-star player. Paulus, I think at the time might have been a 3 or a 4. Those things mean things to the people that send money into the Rams Club and to the Iron Dukes and this, that, and the other. So that's the deal. That's how it worked out. Russell, we knew, wanted to play baseball. I never got the opportunity to talk with Mike Fox about it because I said this to my staff. Get him to come in January. Let's go through this class and get these guys in. Let's get him to come in early January. And I couldn't quite convince my staff that was the right direction to go. And once again, that's it.
As much as Elliott Avent and Mark Trestman and Chuck Amato and even John Bunning liked Russell Wilson, Russ still had work to do to become NC State's quarterback. There was even a moment in Russ's second year where he was asked to play defense, and that was something he never let go of. We'll get into all of that in episode 3 of the Russell Wilson podcast. Never failed.